I bought the cabin on a Thursday in October, and I told no one. That probably sounds strange. Most people, when they finally close on a property they've been saving for over 4 years, call someone, a friend, a parent, a sister. They take pictures of themselves holding the keys and they post it somewhere, and they let people be happy for them. I didn't do any of that. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the title company for about 20 minutes, holding the folder with my documents inside, and I just breathed. In and out. Slowly. Because I knew what telling people would mean. I knew exactly what would happen the moment the news got out. I had lived with my brother long enough to understand how information traveled in my family, and I had learned the hard way more than once that good news in our family wasn't something that belonged to you. It became something that belonged to everyone, and everyone always seemed to mean him. My brother is 4 years older than me. Growing up, I adored him the way younger siblings do when they don't know any better. He was funny and loud, and the kind of person who filled up a room when he walked in. My parents thought he was extraordinary. They still do. He has that quality some people have where they move through life assuming that things will be provided for them, and somehow, they always are. Not because they work for them, because someone else does, and they simply receive. I was usually that someone. I don't say this with bitterness anymore, though for a long time I did. I say it because it is accurate and because it matters for everything that happened later. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had lent my brother money 17 times. I kept a notebook. Not to be petty, I kept it because I needed to see it written down. Needed the proof of it in ink so that I couldn't gaslight myself into thinking it hadn't happened. 17 times. The amounts ranged from $40 to $3,000. He paid me back twice, partially, and both times he acted as though he was doing me a favor. When he married his wife 8 years ago, I thought maybe things would change. She was organized and confident, and I genuinely liked her when we first met. But I came to understand, over time, that she and my brother were a matched set in the specific way that mattered most. They both believed, with no apparent guilt, that the people around them existed to make their lives more comfortable. She was not cruel about it. Neither was he, really. They simply had a kind of cheerful entitlement that didn't register its own weight on other people. I stopped lending money the year I turned 30. It was not a dramatic conversation. I just started saying no, quietly and without explanation, and enduring the cold silences that followed. By the time I was 33, I had moved to a different city for work, paid off my car, built a savings account that I didn't tell my family existed, and begun looking at properties in the mountains about 2 hours north of where I lived. I had wanted a cabin since I was a child. My family had rented one once, when I was 7, and I remember the smell of pine and the sound of the creek behind the property and the way the mornings felt slower there, like time had agreed to behave differently. I never forgot it. I held on to that memory through every hard year, every tight budget, every time I said no to something I wanted because I was being careful. That cabin was the point of the carefulness. I found the one I bought after 18 months of looking. It was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a stone fireplace, a covered porch that looked out over a ridge of trees. The previous owners had maintained it well. The roof was newer. The heating system was solid. It needed cosmetic work, but nothing structural, and the price was within what I had saved if I was willing to accept a modest mortgage on the remainder. I made an offer on a Monday. They accepted by Wednesday. I closed on a Thursday. I sat in that parking lot and I held my documents and I thought, this is mine. No one else's name is on this. No one else signed anything. This is entirely, legally, completely mine. I drove up to see it that same evening. I brought a sleeping bag and a thermos of coffee, and I slept on the floor of the living room with the fireplace going, and I woke up to frost on the windows and bird sound outside, and I thought, I am never telling my brother about this place. I managed to keep the secret for 6 weeks. It was my mother who let it slip. I had told her in confidence because she asked me directly why I had been making trips north, and I couldn't lie to her face. I told her it was a small cabin, that I was still settling in, that I wanted to keep it quiet for a while. She promised she understood. She did not tell my brother to be malicious. She told him the way she always shared things about me casually, incidentally, as though my life was a piece of community property. My brother called me on a Sunday evening in late November. I saw his name on my screen and I felt the particular feeling I had trained myself to recognize over the years. A kind of low-grade dread, like a weather change. I answered because not answering only delayed things and made them worse. He was warm and chatty for the first few minutes. He asked about work. He mentioned that his wife's sister was visiting. He asked if I'd seen the game the night before. I said I hadn't. He said that was too bad. And then, the way he always did it casually, as though it were a small thing, an afterthought, he said he'd heard I'd bought a place up in the mountains. I said yes. He said that was great, really great. He was proud of me. And then he said that he'd been talking to his wife, and they thought it would be a wonderful idea to bring the whole family up for Thanksgiving. His wife's parents, her sister and her sister's husband, their 3 kids, his 2 friends from work, and their wives, and of course mom and dad. I counted while he was talking. That was 16 people. I told him the cabin had 2 bedrooms. He laughed. He said people could sleep anywhere. It was a cabin. That was half the fun. He said I didn't need to worry. He said mom was so excited. I asked him when he had told mom. He said he hadn't, not yet, but he was sure she would be. I held the phone and I looked out my apartment window at the streetlights, and I understood completely and clearly what was happening. He had already decided. The invitation had already gone out in his head. My cabin was already, in his mind, a family property, a resource he had discovered, and was now allocating. He was informing me of a plan that I would accommodate because I had always accommodated. I said, I'll think about it. He said, great, I'll send you the dates. We're thinking the Wednesday before through the Sunday after. 5 days, 16 people, in a 2-bedroom cabin I had owned for 6 weeks. I said, I'll be in touch. I hung up and I sat down on my couch, and I was quiet for a very long time. Here is what I want to explain, because I have seen the question come up in places where people discuss situations like mine, and the question is always the same. Why didn't you just say no? Right then, on the phone, why didn't you simply say no? I understand why that seems like the obvious answer. I do. But if you have spent your entire life in a family system where your no is treated as an opening position, where it is met with pressure and guilt, and the slow erosion of repetition until you either give in or cut off entirely, then you know that no is not the simple word it sounds like from the outside. I had said no to my brother many times. What followed was always the same. Calls from my mother asking me to reconsider. My father going quiet in a way that felt like disappointment. My brother sending texts that reframed the situation until my refusal looked unreasonable. It never ended cleanly. It always cost something. So I did not say no on the phone. I said I would think about it. And then I thought about something else entirely. I opened my laptop that same night and I searched the vacation rental regulations for the county where my cabin was located. I already had a rough sense of them, because I had looked into the possibility of listing the property myself someday. What I confirmed that night was this. In that county, short-term vacation rentals required a permit. The permit was tied to the owner's name and the specific property. Operating an unpermitted rental or listing a property without the owner's written consent was a violation that could result in fines up to $5,000 per incident and potential civil liability. I wrote that down. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do for another few months. I called a property management company that operated in the area and I asked about their services. I explained that I had a cabin and was concerned about unauthorized use. They told me what their monitoring packages included. I said I would be in touch. Then I called a locksmith. I told my brother the following Wednesday that Thanksgiving wasn't going to work. I kept it simple. I said the cabin wasn't ready for guests. I was still doing work on it, and I wasn't comfortable with a large group there. He pushed back, gently at first and then with more weight. He said he'd already mentioned it to a few people. I said I was sorry to hear that, but the answer was no. He went quiet. Then he said he was disappointed. He said he thought I had changed. I said I hoped so. We didn't speak for 3 weeks. What I did not know during those 3 weeks was what he was doing. I found out on a Monday in mid-December when I received an email notification from Airbnb. The email informed me that someone had flagged a listing that appeared to use my property's address. The platform's trust and safety team was reaching out to verify ownership and consent. I read the email twice. Then I opened Airbnb and searched my cabin's address. The listing was there. It had been active for 11 days. There were 12 bookings already confirmed, stretching from the week before Christmas through mid-January. The nightly rate was set at $280. The photos were ones I recognized. I had taken them myself in October and saved them to a shared family photo album that my mother managed. The description read like it had been written by someone who had never set foot in the property but had read my messages about it carefully. It mentioned the stone fireplace. It mentioned the ridge view. It mentioned the creek. The contact on the listing was not my brother's name. It was his wife's maiden name, but the payout account, which I could not see directly, would later be confirmed by the platform's investigation as linked to a joint account they shared. I sat at my kitchen table and I did not feel what I expected to feel. I didn't feel rage, exactly. I felt something cleaner and colder than rage. I felt the specific clarity that comes when something you suspected about a person is finally confirmed in a way that removes all ambiguity. I called Airbnb's trust and safety line directly, and I explained that I was the property owner, that this listing had been created without my knowledge or consent, and that I had documentation to support my ownership. They asked me to submit my deed and a photo ID, which I did within the hour. They told me the listing would be suspended pending investigation and that all upcoming bookings would be flagged. Then I called the non-emergency line for the county sheriff's office where the cabin was located. I explained the situation. The officer I spoke with took a report and told me this qualified as potential fraud and unauthorized use of property. He said someone from the department would follow up. Then I called the locksmith I had already spoken to, and I confirmed the appointment I had scheduled for that Friday. New deadbolt, new keypad code, no copies of the original key outstanding. Then I called a local attorney whose name I had found when I was researching the rental regulations. I left a message. She called back within 2 hours. I explained everything. She said I had a strong case for civil damages given the bookings already made, the unauthorized use of my photos, and the misrepresentation of the property. She said she would review the documentation and we would talk next week. I did not call my brother. I did not call my mother. I did not send any messages. I drove up to the cabin that Friday morning. I watched the locksmith change the locks. I walked through every room and I checked every window latch, and I stood on the porch in the December cold, and I looked out at the tree line and I thought, this is still mine. My brother called me that Friday afternoon while I was on the drive home. He was different on the phone than he had been in November. The warmth was gone. He skipped the small talk entirely. He said he'd heard from Airbnb that the listing had been suspended, and he wanted to know why I had done that. I want to note something about that phrasing. He said he wanted to know why I had done that, as though the suspension of a listing he had created without my knowledge was something I had done to him. I told him I had reported an unauthorized listing of my property to the platform, which I was both entitled and obligated to do. He said it was just a listing. It wasn't a big deal. He was just trying to help me make some income off the place since I wasn't using it anyway. I asked him if he had my permission to create the listing. He said I would have said yes if he'd asked. I told him that was not the same thing as asking. He said I was being dramatic. He said this was exactly what he meant when he said I had changed. He said I used to be easier to talk to. I said I was going to let the process play out and that I would be in touch when I had more information. He said, what process? I told him the sheriff's office had taken a report. The silence on the other end of the phone was a different kind of silence than any I had heard from him before. It was not the strategic silence of someone waiting for me to soften. It was the silence of someone who had not believed, until that moment, that I would actually do it. I said goodbye. I hung up. My mother called 4 times that evening. I let it go to voicemail each time. Her messages escalated from confused to upset to something close to accusatory. She said I was breaking up the family over nothing. She said my brother had only been trying to help. She said I needed to think about what I was doing before I made things worse. I listened to all 4 messages. Then I put my phone face down on my kitchen counter and I made dinner. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Airbnb's team confirmed within 8 days that the listing had been created without owner consent, using photos taken from a private family album without permission and with a description that contained specific details that could only have come from private communications. They removed the listing permanently and banned the account. They also notified the guests with confirmed bookings that their reservations had been invalidated and initiated refunds. Here's the part I want to be specific about, because this was the part I had not fully anticipated. Several of those guests were angry, rightfully so. They had paid for a property that was not available to them and had, in some cases, made travel arrangements around the booking. 3 of them filed complaints. One of them had already traveled partway to the property before being notified. That guest filed a small claims action against the account holder for travel expenses. The county sheriff's office followed up the following week. A deputy contacted me to say that they had reviewed the report and the documentation I had submitted, and that based on the information available, the situation met the threshold for criminal investigation into fraud and unauthorized use of property for financial gain. They would be reaching out to my brother and his wife separately. My attorney sent a formal demand letter the same week. The letter detailed the unauthorized listing, the income generated from the 12 bookings before suspension, which totaled approximately $18,000, none of which I had received, and the legal exposure my brother and his wife now faced. It requested full accounting of all funds received, return of all such funds to the guests or to me as appropriate, and a written acknowledgement that the property was mine, and that they had no claim to it or its rental income. My brother did not respond to the letter personally. His attorney did, 3 weeks later. The response was defensive, but not, notably, a denial. It characterized the listing as a misunderstanding arising from an assumption of permission, which is a very particular kind of non-denial that attorneys use when the facts are not on their side. My attorney wrote back. She was thorough and she was precise, and I was very glad I had called her. The resolution came in stages, the way these things do. The financial settlement was handled out of court. My brother and his wife agreed to repay the full amount of rental income, collected $18,040, plus my attorney's fees of $4,200, plus the travel expenses of the guest who had filed in small claims. The total came to just over $25,000. The agreement was signed in February, about 10 weeks after I had first seen the listing. As part of the agreement, they also signed a document acknowledging that the property was mine, that they had no legal interest in it, and that they would make no further representations about the property to third parties. The county's decision was separate from the civil matter. The district attorney reviewed the file and declined to pursue criminal charges, determining that the civil resolution and the lack of prior record made prosecution unlikely to proceed. I did not have strong feelings about that decision either way. The civil outcome was what had mattered to me most. My relationship with my brother is not what it was. That is perhaps the sentence I have turned over the most in the months since, because what it was is the question that makes the whole thing complicated. What it was, if I am honest, was never what I had needed it to be. It was a relationship in which I gave and he received, and I had convinced myself for a long time that this was love because it was the only version of love I had seen modeled in my family when it came to the two of us. I am not interested in a relationship that requires me to be smaller so that someone else can feel larger. I am not interested in apologizing for having things that are mine. My mother is still upset with me. She calls occasionally. The conversations are careful and surface level, and I can hear in her voice the restraint of someone who wants to say more than they're saying. I don't push her on it. I have learned to let some silences stay. My father told me, in a brief phone call in March, that he thought I had handled a difficult situation with more maturity than he might have expected. That was the closest thing to an apology I received from anyone in my family. I thanked him and I meant it. The cabin is exactly what I needed it to be. I drive up most weekends now, sometimes Friday evening and sometimes early Saturday depending on the week. I have learned where the good trailheads are and which ones flood in spring. I have a neighbor 2 properties over, who bakes and leaves things on my porch sometimes, and I bring her coffee from the good place in town when I pass through on my way in. The stone fireplace works perfectly. The porch view does not get old. I am telling this story not because I want sympathy, and not because I want anyone to think poorly of my brother as a person. He is not a villain. He is a person who was never taught that the things belonging to others had weight, had meaning, had limits that deserved respect. That is a failure of his own doing now that he is an adult, but it is also a failure of the way we were raised together, and I hold both of those things at once without needing to resolve them. I am telling this story because I spent 38 years making myself easier for other people to live with, and it cost me things I cannot fully measure. And then one October, I bought a cabin that belonged entirely to me, and when someone tried to take it not violently, not dramatically, but in the slow and confident way that people who have never been stopped before take things, I did not perform outrage and I did not make speeches. I changed the locks. I called the right people. I let the process work. And then I drove up on a Saturday morning when there was snow on the ridge, and I made coffee in my kitchen, and I sat on my porch in my coat, and I listened to the creek. The creek sounds exactly the way I remembered it from when I was 7 years old. That might be the thing I am most grateful for.